who wanted to establish a church in Whitesboro. They had sought the assistance and support of the members of Macedonia Baptist Church. So we have been walking together for well over 100 years. So this is just a continuation in that special relationship. Amen? Amen. Amen. Well, my charge today is to share a little history about Juneteenth. And so since context matters, I just want to walk through some other things that, go into why this day is so special. And being a Baptist preacher, I have to stick to the time because Sister Towns gave me, she said, you got 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. So if you know anything about Baptist preachers, that's a challenge. But I am going to remain true to the assignment. So hear me, beloved. Juneteenth is one of the most important holidays in African American history and in the history of the United States, I would submit. Celebrated annually on June 19th, Juneteenth commemorates the end of slavery in the United States and honors the struggles, resilience, and achievements of African Americans. The holiday marks the day in 1865 when enslaved people in Texas finally learned that they were free, more than 2 years after President Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Over time, Juneteenth has evolved from a regional celebration of memory and strength in the face of systematized brutality into a national holiday that encourages all Americans to intentionally reflect on freedom, justice, and equity, in addition to being agents in that transformative work. Now, slavery was introduced into the Western Hemisphere by the Portuguese and the Spanish in the early 16th century. In North America, it was largely the Western European nations of the Netherlands, France, and England who had control of the territory, with the British coming to dominate the region at the close of the 17th century. Between 1619 and the start of the American Revolution, approximately 860,000 African people had been forcibly imported and enslaved in the Northern American colonies, with between 450 to 500,000 being held in bondage at the time the first shots were fired in the battles of Lexington and Concord. 80% of Africans and their descendants were enslaved and forced to labor primarily on plantations throughout the South. Yet in the North, then colonies like New York and especially New Jersey were distinctly supportive of what mass enslaver Thomas Jefferson called the peculiar institution. In a systematic attempt to dehumanize them, enslaved people had no legal rights, could be bought, sold, bequeathed, raped, tortured, and killed, all with no measure of legal recourse. Thus, the separation and destabilization of enslaved black families was common fare, as black people were seen as something other than human, as a means of nefarious convenience. Despite these systematically sadistic conditions, African Americans developed strong communities, cultural traditions, and religious practices that helped sustain them through generations of oppression. The secular and sacred morality regarding the practice and expansion of slavery became one of the most divisive issues in the United States during the 19th century. With anti-abolitionist activity and violence visiting many northern cities, with riots breaking out in places like Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio. I further submit that one could soundly argue that before the nation split over the issue in 1860, the church had done so more than a decade before, with both the Methodist and Baptist denominations doing so in 1844 and 1845, respectively, with the Presbyterians following suit in 1861 after the war had begun. Lincoln's primary goal was to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. He sought to appease the South from seceding, even going so far as to blame black people for their condition of enslavement and offering to the traitor secessionist states a 40-year extension of slavery, thus allowing them to keep their enslaved persons up to 1900. Meaning that America could have brought chattel slavery into the 20th century. Yet on January 1st, 1863, the vacillation stopped. Abraham Lincoln officially issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order declared that enslaved people in the United States rebelling against the Union shall be thenceforward and forever free. Although the proclamation was a significant step toward ending slavery, it did not immediately free all enslaved people. The border states, those states that enslaved black people but remained loyal to the Union, were not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation. For Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and West Virginia, it was the same dehumanizing brutality as usual. In the Confederacy, enforcement depended largely on the presence of Union troops. Thus, many enslaved people in Confederate-controlled areas remained unaware of the proclamation or continued to be held in bondage because slaveholders refused to recognize it. Texas, in particular, because of its location, became a refuge for enslavers because it was far from the major battlefields and had relatively few Union soldiers. As a result, slavery continued there even after the proclamation had taken effect. Yet it bears mentioning that as a result of the proclamation, about 500,000 black people escaped and sought asylum behind Union lines. But it is important to know that African Americans were active participants in the war effort. Black people served in a number of capacities after being allowed to enlist and served with bravery and dignity. The Civil War effectively ended in April 1865 when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. About 250,000 African Americans in Texas remained in bondage, and on June 19, 1865, Union Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, with approximately 2,000 federal troops, many of whom were African American. He issued General Order Number 3, announcing the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive Order of the United States, all slaves are free. The declaration informed 250,000 enslaved African Americans in Texas that they were legally free. The order also emphasized a relationship between former masters and enslaved people that would be replaced by one between employers and hired laborers. That is, if the formerly enslaved persons chose to stay. For many African Americans, on June 19th represented a long-awaited day of liberation. The formerly enslaved engaged in a litany of activities including praise, prayer, worship, communal celebrations, yes. Many, in an effort to reconnect their families, left their places of bondage to find family members who had been sold off. Although Juneteenth marked the effective end of slavery in Texas, slavery was not officially abolished throughout the United States until the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution in December 1865. New Jersey failed to ratify the 13th Amendment initially, not doing so until January of 1866. Given our state's pro-Confederate leanings and business interests, our sad position on the matter of black emancipation should surprise very few. The amendment prohibits slavery and involuntary servitude except as punishment for a crime, a caveat that remains within the amendment to this day. Yet, as we are all aware, the 13th Amendment ended in its most conventional form the institution of slavery in the United States. Now, African Americans began celebrating Juneteenth almost immediately after 1865, largely centered around the church. Early observances included prayer meetings, full-on worship services, complete with food and music. Another common feature were public readings of the Emancipation Proclamation. These celebrations provided fellowship opportunities for the newly emancipated to gather with family and friends to remember and celebrate their newly legislated freedom. During the late 19th to mid-20th century, Black people in Texas often faced discrimination and were denied access to public parks due to Jim Crow laws. In response, Black communities raised money to purchase their own land for Juneteenth celebrations. One notable example was Emancipation Park in Houston, established in 1872 specifically for Juneteenth festivities. As African Americans migrated to other regions of the country during the 20th century, they carried Juneteenth traditions with them. However, during certain periods, particularly during the Great Depression and World War II, public celebrations declined. Juneteenth celebrations did experience a resurgence during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, when activists emphasized the importance of Black history, unity, and freedom. Texas became the first state to officially recognize Juneteenth as a state holiday in 1980, due mostly to the efforts of state legislator Al Edwards. Over the following decades, other states gradually adopted official recognition. One of the most influential advocates for national recognition was Opal Lee, often called, the grandmother of Juneteenth. Beginning in her 80s, Lee organized walks and campaigns to raise awareness about the importance of making Juneteenth a federal holiday. And I'm happy to report that she is still among the living at the ripe age of 99. On June 17th, amen. Amen. On June 17, 2021, President Joe Biden signed legislation establishing Juneteenth, National Independence Day, as the 11th federal holiday in the United States. The action received broad bipartisan support and represented a significant acknowledgement of African American history and our continuing struggle for justice and equity. By God's grace and the intentional actions of His creation, Juneteenth is now celebrated throughout our nation. Communities come together for parades, festivals, concerts, educational programs, and family reunions. Churches often hold worship services and special commemorations that connect the themes of liberation, justice, and equity with the mission and ministry of Jesus Christ. The holiday also serves as a time for education and reflection. Schools, museums, and civic organizations use Juneteenth to examine the history of slavery, Reconstruction, segregation, and the ongoing pursuit of civil rights.
All right.
Many Americans view the day not only as a celebration of freedom, but also as an opportunity to confront the nation's history honestly and work toward greater justice and equality. Beloved, Juneteenth commemorates a pivotal movement in American history when freedom finally reached enslaved African Americans in Texas on June 19, 1865. Although emancipation has still not brought the equity we desire in our pursuit of a more perfect union, we honor and remember what Juneteenth meant to our ancestors, a sacrosanct day that symbolized hope, liberation, and the beginning of a new chapter in the lives of millions of people. Over the years, Juneteenth has grown from a local celebration in Texas to a national observance that honors the struggles and achievements of African Americans. And as we come together each year to celebrate Juneteenth, we are called to remember the enduring importance of freedom. We are charged to willingly acknowledge our common humanity and we must enthusiastically embrace our responsibility to uphold the ideals of justice and equality for all Americans. Beloved, we can accept nothing less. As Frederick Douglass reminds us, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never will. Thank you, and may God bless you.